I am a Senior Associate at Interactive Law Group, and I am here with Andrew Paradisi? Paradise. Andrew Paradise is the CEO and founder of Skillz, and the worldwide leader in mobile esports. We have Ari Segal, who is president and COO of Immortals LLC. He also has a pretty strong background in traditional sports models. He worked previously with the Anaheim Ducks, I believe, and he is currently with the Los Angeles Valiant. And then we have Robb Chiarini, the head of Esports and NCSA at Ubisoft. So getting started, let's talk about where esports is today and what it looks like now. Robb, could you give us an idea of who the major players are and major investors are in esports right now?
So when we talk about esports, we're talking about a massive ecosystem, right? It's all of the sports together. Mm-hmm. There's so many different games, publishers, and entities involved. It's really hard to just talk about esports. And we do that all the time. This week we talked about the large scale of what esports is because we're trying to compare it to other models that we're used to, right? It's just for understanding. So when you look at some of the largest players out there, you're looking at Blizzard, you know, their host of games, Overwatch, Hearthstone, StarCraft has been around forever. You look at League of Legends and Riot, you look at Dota and Valve, CSGO, you know, some of the major players that have been around in the space for a very long time, but there are so many other tiers and groups of games out there, even our own, Rainbow Six and other titles across the board, Activision. I can just go on and on, right? There's tons and tons of them. In the space, we have different kinds of sponsors and brands involved with that, talking about endemic, the hardware partners that you're used to seeing, everything from PC suppliers, NVIDIA's, AMD's, you're talking about Origins. Intel is one of the largest brands known in esports that you see everywhere. And then you've got teams and organizations that have sponsors ranging from drink products to turtle wax, right? And everything in between, every kind of gamut of sponsors and endemics and non-endemics in the space. So it's a really massive ecosystem of things with a lot of potential for growth still, but so many things already involved.
Okay. Well, so go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on that. So a couple of interesting things to think about, and I'll give you the startup perspective, which is when we started out in 2012, esports wasn't really a word. Actually, our first seed stage VCs were like, you shouldn't use that term to describe your business. That doesn't make any sense, and I've never heard of it. And kind of fast forward to like 15 was like really 2015 was like a big year because you have both Activision Blizzard and EA in Q4 announce, hey, we're going to build multi-billion-dollar businesses in this space. And I think many of the other major studios followed suit. I'm guessing you guys as well, all started saying, hey, we're going to open up esports jobs. I actually was talking to someone who said there are now 30 esports jobs on the Activision Blizzard job site right now.
At any one time. At any one time.
Yeah, 30 listed right now, which is kind of incredible if you think about like the growth from 15 to 18. 16 was, for at least for us, we started with mobile and tablet and really saying that mobile and tablet would be the future of computing and therefore the future of esports. And so we attacked mobile and tablet from the beginning, and you know, there's, I'll be candid, a fair amount of ridicule when we started. And that's, I think, changed to more and more recognition that mobile esports is legitimate and growing, and whether it's stuff like Clash Royale or Hearthstone or Vainglory or our platform, that there's a lot of content now becoming available on mobile esports. So the end of 16, you had Amazon launching the Champions of Fire tournament, which I don't know how many people here attended that. A couple of us raise our hands. Yeah, accidentally went to it. It was in Vegas. It was pretty interesting. You know, it just showed you how like nascent esports is, particularly in mobile. The broadcast quality, the games they could play, how they organize the tournaments is really interesting. And then, you know, the big thing in 17, the thing I think a lot about is just right now most popular offline sport in the world is soccer or football if you're not from the U.S. 265 million people have ever played soccer. You look at the people who play video games, there are between mobile, computer, and console, it's close to 3.5 billion people have ever tried a video game. And so when you think about like the room for growth for competitive play and for interest at every level of that like competition pyramid as you get to, you know, the really top competitors and top leagues, you know, I think we have a long way to go. in terms of how big it's going to be. We're certainly very bullish. We think the U.S. sports industry at $100+ billion industry, half of it will probably become esports over time.
Excellent. Okay, and that kind of segues nicely into my next question, which is how exactly is esports structured right now? You call it an ecosystem, but there are owners and there are players and there are leagues and there are publishers and developers. How does everybody fit in this infrastructure?
Sure, I could take that. I think the word esports, Rob was getting at this a little bit, is a simplifying term that is just a label to describe something that's really complex. And the reason I say that is within each game, within each esport, the structure can vary pretty widely. And by the way, the same thing is true in traditional sports, so don't be scared off by that. For example, let's take 3. PGA Tour golf, NFL football, English Premier League soccer. All very successful, all completely different models. PGA Tour, open model, anyone can go and qualify for the US Open. Depending on how you perform, you might earn a PGA Tour card. NFL, very restrictive, 32 teams. No matter how bad the Cleveland Browns are, they're not going to get kicked out of the league. English Premier League, promotion relegation. There's a fixed number of slots at the top. You can earn your way in, you can earn your way out, but there is some sort of embedded franchise value even at the lower divisions. Esports, similar. Riot is probably the most closed model. They're moving into a franchise system for League of Legends. Their franchise model is highly centralized, where Activision's Overwatch League, in which we participate, is a little bit more of a localized franchise model similar to traditional sports. Then you have a publisher like Valve, which is much more open source, much more egalitarian and democratic. And so within each esport, and I think, by the way, this is pretty exciting for fans, you can find a match of what is the competitive scene that you're drawn to, combined with the IP that you find compelling, combined with kind of the competitive framework that you find enjoyable to watch or play in. So the diversity of esports is something that I think has kind of created a really nice tailwind as it started to grow.
And that leads actually really well into the next one too, which is publisher and developer roles. It sounds like publishers and developers really control how each esport operates, but I imagine that varies as well based on the league system and the players involved.
Yeah, and so again, esport, like we'll just set the expectation for this room, right? Esport, we're talking about a publisher-led program around a game. Right, because for me, I came up in the community running community tournaments, which is now kind of still considered and lumped underneath the esport hashtag of things, right? So guys playing at their house. If we actually turned this room and put stations on all these tables and we started running a tournament, that's technically an esport nowadays in the world. But we're talking about a publisher-led program, a high-end with leagues, teams, structure around it, as opposed to just community tournaments, online tournaments, and just for the fun of it. And so when we look at that, it's almost always a publisher-led program. Valve is kind of the exception where they have an overarching thing that they do, that they include some other programs within it or allow other people to use their license. But for the most part, you're talking about, we've decided on a structure and a format for the league and how people will participate in that, whether it be franchised or not franchised, whether it be open relegation, open tournaments, whatever that structure might be, and put together the pricing and the formalities behind that, whether we use a league operator like ESL or Gfinity or anyone else, or operate it ourselves. In the case of Blizzard does a lot of that, right? And so, or Riot's probably the premier one of that nowadays, of running their own league. And so whatever those different components are of the structure and the rule set and the pricing and the organizers within that ecosystem and allowing the teams to play in that vary greatly, right, for each and every one of us and how we want to approach that. Whether it's because we felt that, because we're adopting community set rules, that a community has run a tournament for a long time and we feel like onboarding that. But for the most part, it's a marketing opportunity for us to leverage and fulfill the dreams of the community, as well as follow our marketing plan and what we're trying to do with the game and the direction we're taking it.
Just to jump in on that, so we're a third party that is a tournament operator for about 7,000 developers, and so maybe kind of a very different stance from like a Ubisoft where they're building in-house. I think when we started out and we talked to a lot of the major developers, whether it's Activision or Ubi or whoever else it was, there's a lot of like, how am I going to own the future of the NFL? And when you actually think about the value chain of like offline sports and how it's developed, it looks somewhere, well, there are many models per the earlier point from Ari, but some of the most successful models, like the NFL model, involve franchising, and one of the reasons franchising is so important is it allows outside investment to buy teams, to invest in other parts of the infrastructure to run the overall spectacles that we want and we are looking for in society. And when you look at like Overwatch, for example, actually 4 of the investors in our company are also Overwatch team owners. They all bought in actually that first round of like 8 buyers. And why did they do that? Well, they're looking to make infrastructure investments into esports because they see esports, and I think maybe in another 5 years we'll look back and say, hey, esports really is just the online equivalent of what's been going on offline for so long. You know, the early term of esports, people were very confused. I think there still is confusion around what is an esport. Often people ask that, like particularly consumers, less and less the investor community, less and less the business community. But when you think about the construction of the leagues, the construction of tournament operations, some of the earliest stuff in what was originally competitive gaming and became esports, like the ESL, like MLG, but they were completely independent organizations, and they actually often had problems working with the publishers. I have a friend who is running the 3rd in-class league, where they literally received notice from a very famous publisher, hey, we don't want you to do this next, that version of the first-person shooter at your next competition because we're promoting this new one that's coming out in 3 months. And so even though all of your players and all of the fans want to watch the old version of content, we don't want that, kind of out there. So there is a lot of very interesting friction there. Probably the most famous example is StarCraft. I was a huge StarCraft player growing up. It actually, what I would argue, is organically the first competitive esport. In South Korea, the viewing audience, at one point there were 4 TV channels, all organic, of people watching StarCraft. And then they went and released StarCraft 2. And the reason I say it like that is, as a StarCraft player, and I pride myself on being pretty good. I'm actually now, I finally beat Diamond League, so I'm top 2% globally. It's very disappointing to have the nature of the game changed when you have a lot of investment into the play behavior, into the play style, and then have the rules change the last second. Kind of an analogy I'd give you is like XFL versus the NFL, or the Canadian Football League versus the NFL. And it's not like a huge change, perhaps, to many people, but to your diehard players, to your diehard fans, it's massive, right? And it can really impact your overall affinity for the sport. So it's really interesting to see how all these different activities are evolving, whether it's publisher-led programs like, I think Overwatch is arguably the biggest, highest profile thing happening right now in the world in terms of publisher-led, or third-party like us, where we're independent, all we focus on is tournaments, and that's really our business. Our business is all about automating and trying to build more and more of an at-home environment for competitive play, or third-party providers like the ESL, I would say MLG, but they've obviously been acquired now by Activision. So it's just pretty interesting to see all of the evolution of the infrastructure and what's happening. I think the overall recognition just goes back to that idea that there are billions of people who have played a video game, and some subset of those people will want to compete, some subset of those billions of people will want to watch, or maybe even a superset, right? Like what's happened in offline sports, where I've never really played basketball, but I have friends who have played, and they bring me to watch the NBA. And it's this like social outing where the first time I ever saw a basketball game I had never played, and they actually explained the rules to me. And I think that kind of organic social network is forming around esports, where people, I've explained to people how like a league match works, right? They're like, what is esports? And I'm like, well, let's turn on Twitch and like watch a game. And they're like, what is going on the screen? And so, sorry, not to be long-winded there, but I do think the evolution of the infrastructure is a pretty fascinating part of the space.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing, and that was the purchase of ESL by Activision. Is that something we're likely to see more?
MLG.
What?
MLG.
MLG.
ESL
MLG.
still says their own thing.
Major League Gaming.
Owned
Yeah,
by
okay.
MTG, but
He mentioned ESL and MLG, and I wasn't sure which one he was referencing in the purchase. So Activision purchased MLG. Is that something we're going to see, like with the ESLs and with the other independents?
And I can go back just from a personal experience. At one time, I worked at IGN, which is a very famous website and a content creation company around video games, if you're not aware. And we spun up the IPL, the IGN Pro League, and we actually were running leagues around League of Legends. We did the original before LCS was an LCS, and WCS before that was a thing at StarCraft. And we were bought by another company, Ziff Davis, and through an acquisition and merger, we all moved to Blizzard. We actually were purchased by Blizzard. And so Blizzard bought IGN, or IPL, and Activision, essentially, both of them bought MLG. So I do see somewhat of a, not a land grab of resources, but some of those being able to internalize some of those resources is interesting. But I think now is at a time that was really the only great people in the space doing things. Not to discount guys like me from the community, but like when you see people with talent and you're wanting to internalize that, what do? You snipe them, right? And so they were just sniping whole companies
so
in a good way.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I was watching CNBC a month or two ago, and someone was talking about Netflix, actually, and Disney and some of the changes that were going on. This is before the announcement of the Fox acquisition by Disney. And the question was posed, would you rather be a content creator or a distributor? And the answer was yes. Right? And so I think that dynamic exists really across the sports and entertainment media landscape, and it's also true in esports. So your question to me is, will there be ongoing M&A? Is there capital that can be brought to bear by equity investors or even lenders to facilitate the merging or consolidation of assets in esports? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes.
Yes. So that goes into the next one. What kind of current opportunities are there for investors right now? Where is there to invest, and where are people putting their money right now?
Yeah, so as a team operator, look.
Who's firmly in your court?
I think the question isn't, is there an opportunity available for investment in esports by an investor? But the question is, who is the investor? What is their profile? What are they trying to achieve? Because there are so many opportunities across the landscape that you can independently as an investor choose where you want to play, or you can choose across several different dimensions of the space. So for example, I think when most people think about how can I invest in esports, they're thinking of, should I invest in a team? But look at the guys sitting next to me now. There's opportunities to invest into publishers. There's opportunities to invest in third-party providers, organizers, services companies that have sprung up to support these things. And even now, with the growth of kind of live esports and digital esports, there's opportunities to invest in distribution around esports, both online via Amazon through Twitch, for example, or Activision with MLG, or Disney through BAM, or the tournament circuit. So there have been tournaments at Madison Square Garden, which is a publicly traded company, and many others around the world. So I think the opportunities for investment are ubiquitous.
Yeah. I would say content is another thing, specific, right?
Yeah, oh sure, yeah.
Absolutely. Become a content creator around those things and around the programs, and being able to develop something that, I see a bunch of them. There's a bunch of people contacting me about, hey, I'm starting up these new channels as point about distribution or just content. We're trying to create shows and information around these programs. How can we get your content and be able to do something and leverage that? So there's tons of ways around that. From a publisher standpoint, we're always looking for partners to be able to do things like we work with various vendors and things. So I'm sure that there's opportunities for investment upon that if that's something of interest. The key thing, if many of you don't know, around esports, we're really talking about an IP that's owned by a publisher. So that game, unlike football or soccer or anything else you want to call it, we own the game. And so to your point about, hey, they changed the game on me, they put out a new game and now they're supporting this game, is that's in our business model, right? We create games, we create content, we create fans and people who we can monetize against. And so we own that, and we allow, it's not a bad thing, but we allow people like third parties to run those things. And we've run into some of those where up until a point, and then they want you to stop and they send you a letter to do something like that. Hopefully we're never so hand-to-be-handed and we're able to support the games across the board. But other publishers do have different viewpoints of how they would support their titles. But all those spaces.
I thought you were going to say reputations.
Yeah, no, but and so when we look at investments, teams are I want to say the low-hanging fruit, but it is the most accessible route for investment because that is something that is very traditional in the traditional sports sense. It's something that's understandable. I have a team, I have personalities, I know how to build a franchise around these players and these personalities, just like NBA or anything, NASCAR or anything else, and be able to work with other partners to subsidize my investment. So there's lots of places around the teams that we really talk about. It's probably the easiest route for investment to get in there.
Just to kind of cut in on that a little bit, I do think not all esports are going to be necessarily entirely publisher controlled, right? Like, so if you think about the developers that partner with us, why are they partnering with us? Well, not everyone and every studio can afford I don't know even how many hundreds of millions of dollars each of the companies we're talking about are pouring into individual esports, but I can tell you, like, thinking about just Overwatch alone, it was $20 million to buy a team. Your operating costs as a team owner might be another $20 million per year as you're getting up and running, and hopefully you're on a 2-3 year time horizon putting in $60 million to generate a higher return. It's a lot of money to put into a single team and a single franchise. And whether or not that continues and that grows into being what the model is for esports, I think a lot of it depends on what happens with Overwatch and whether or not a lot of the let's call them the billionaire families or entities that invest in and own sports teams in America today. I mean, many of those teams are the same companies and groups buying into esports. And so if they get terribly burned by things like Overwatch, I think we might see a lot less franchising and a lot less of that model, and whether or not it kind of continues. They certainly have a lot invested now to try and make it work. If you kind of go across the spectrum to Casual Connect, where I think a lot of the companies here are indies and are looking at how do I harness esports to make money? Why does esports exist? So at least our take on that is multiplayer was created to deliver better retention, right? As a way to make the games more exciting, more interesting, to create a infinite supply of content. Yeah, it's a core loop that lets you sell competition. When you look up the food chain and the way we look at it in crowdfunded competition, and probably your biggest crowdfunded competition in the world right now is the Dota 2 International, I would argue quite clearly an esport competition, not one of the ones run by some of these companies that are spending a lot of the money trying to build out esports, but very, very popular, right? Dota 2 is huge. Definitely, I think we'd all agree top 5. Is that fair?
Yep.
So top 5 esport currently, all crowdfunded. And then you go to your final piece of that pyramid and you think about the pinnacle events where, I think it really inspired the offline sports team owners specifically, were things like League of Legends. And it was very much in their wheelhouse of, okay, I'm going to run a brand-sponsored competition where I'm making my money from advertising, from selling event tickets, from merchandising, from kind of all of the activities that I'm used to making money from with an offline sport like football. In fact, some of the offline sports team owners I know who have bought teams who are not kind of the new world order, they're kind of the old guard, and they're buying esports teams. What they're looking at is, hey, I know how to make money on football. I'm going to buy a esports brand so that I can leverage how I made money on football against this new activity, and kind of just bring that marketing engine and that monetization engine against this new activity. And so it's very different angles in terms of how I think people are attacking, trying to monetize and make money in esports. And it's, I think, a wild west. Like I hear about new companies every day pretty much, in all kinds of different places in the infrastructure stack.
Rob, okay. Well, that does kind of go into my next question, which is about how are leagues, and this is for Rob and Ari, how are leagues handling players, and what does the league and player relation look like now versus, sure. We're going to talk about the future in a minute.
Just to speak about, we're all different, right? Blizzard, Dota, Riot, Ubisoft, all different in the way that we handle our leagues and the way that we handle our structure. There are some best practices, and there are some overarching rule sets, but we all handle and have different regulations around how players and teams are managed, right? And so we have a very open architecture. We have the ability for teams to come in and earn their spots, and they win through that. Teams are organized by, we just started a couple of years ago with our Rainbow Six Pro League. So all the teams were just dudes that got together and started up a new brand and a logo and started playing. And through time have been sponsored, and some have picked up better sponsors, some got picked up with smaller. It's the small fish to the bigger fish to the bigger fish. And now we have premier teams that are in other leagues and other groups that are now buying our teams. It's just a manifestation of that. And so the regulation that we have, we're not putting in any player team minimums. There's no requirements for that. So the league structure is you can earn your way in, and once you're in, you have this path, and this is how you earn money through our system, and then you are free to do your own activities around without these requirements, right? And to other teams and other leagues that I've worked at, are different. To have league minimums and team minimums, when you can talk about that, it's very different across the board, right? There's a lot of different opportunity.
Yeah, and so like what are the strategies involved in that? How do you formulate those strategies in terms of league and player relations, and how does that play into publisher relations, and just kind of explain that how that ecology functions?
Sure. So this is a really complex issue. There's legal implications, there's labor law implications, and frankly, there's just ethical duties on a lot of different sides. One of the things I'm proudest of about Immortals is, I think by all accounts, we have been consistently one of the teams that's most progressive about treatment of players. And that is not only in the way that we pay them, but it's in the way that we design their day and schedule, the way that we try to create work-life balance, and the way that we often do things that are against our short-term interests as an organization to benefit the players. So for example, we've let players out of their contracts with us to go pursue competitive opportunities that were not necessarily consistent with our calendar or our competitive capability at a particular time. We believe that's the right thing to do, but we also believe in the long term that will give us a competitive advantage. We have on-site at our campus in Culver City physical training infrastructure and resources, mental training. All player issues in all sports ultimately come down to recruitment and retention. And that's true of employees really in any company. What is your value proposition as an employer? And so while I think maybe underlying some of your question was, will there be unionization among players, or will there be governing bodies that kind of represent players at scale? I think inevitably when talent emerges and becomes consolidated and professionalized in some way, unionization or something like that tends to follow. I don't know when, I don't know in what form, but I think that's probably a when, not an if. But it really won't affect us because that's already tied into our business model. When you think about the recruitment of players in esports, there's two kinds of recruitment. One is a player who's coming off of their existing contract. The other is the person who's signing their first professional contract. If we have to go into a living room with mom, think of us as a better version of John Calipari, for you college basketball fans out there. We aren't going and saying your kid can become a professional. The value proposition that we want to offer is we will take your son and hopefully your son or daughter and bring them into our campus and treat them how to be a professional. And if their career is 2 years or 4 years or 8 years, they will leave our campus and our infrastructure better equipped to attack their professional life, be it in esports or elsewhere. And yes, that costs us more money. It drives up our operating costs, but we believe it'll help us get better players. And even in unionization, the earlier you get players, the less expensive it tends to be. We also think it will allow us to extend the life of players. So we think we can take a player who is 23, 24, 25 in many esports towards the end of their competitive career, and we think they can be successful under our umbrella into their 30s.
I just want to clarify, not extend the life of the players.
Extend their professional life as a competitive
players.
professional gamer.
Okay.
We are talking about video games. There's always extra lives added to stuff.
That's
There
right.
we go.
And so for us, when we look at our league structure, I can speak to us specifically at Ubisoft, and what we're trying to do is, the players are super important to us. Those are our ambassadors of the game, right? Our first line of that. And so supporting them and supporting the team. So how do we look at organizations and how can we support them through funding, through structure, reorganizing our year to be able to better facilitate their opportunities, to be able to do more things and give them the lead time that they need to recruit, to work with their players. We're trying to change windows of time that all contracts need to be renewed at a specific time. So there's an open free market agent, so it allows teams to be able to recruit and support and be able to pull teams off or pull players off of other teams, et cetera, to refresh their roster. And try and provide opportunities for revenue share amongst the different activities that we do to subsidize their efforts to make the environment better for the players. So those are the ways that we look at how can we better the lives. Other than just putting big prize money and stuff, what are the behind-the-door things that we can do and work with you to have minimums, have structure, have healthcare, have all those things, as well as a system that can support that for you financially to be able to do that for your teams.
Just so you guys know where the industry is coming from, we were considered progressive because we've never missed a player payroll. In the NHL, if a team misses payroll once, for even a single player, every player on their roster becomes an unrestricted free agent instantly. So esports, someone used the term wild, wild west. With respect to player treatment and player payroll and other things like that, as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, it really was the Wild Wild West, and it's people like Robb and companies like Ubisoft, publishers like Ubisoft that are kind of changing the game, and that's, from an Immortal operator standpoint, we want to plug into publishers like that.
Okay, and let's start looking at the future, and I still want to kind of focus on this player and the league and publisher relation looking forward. Especially when we start talking about formalizing and organizing and unionization. How do you see that actually playing out realistically? How do you see the small-time indie players getting a fair shake with the Wild West atmosphere that we have now? And how do we get those players who don't necessarily have to suffer those same restraints or those same threats to be on board and be more supportive of the player community?
Maybe if we could also, just one other thing I wanted to comment on is just this concept of staying power in esports, because one of the things that's very surprising, and we're not really talking about that much right now, but top first-person shooter charting in terms of retention, I would argue, is PUBG, right? I mean, most people would say that their retention surpassed Counter-Strike. They're going to,
small sample size.
Yeah,
sure.
it's a very short window of time. It's a
very
blip.
new. It's very new. But my point being that, in going back to changing the game and having a game that people want to play and compete in, I mean, we can look at the offline world and look at sports that also have died, like football. I think football is at its peak and on decline. And part of the reason is parents in America don't want their kids to have concussions. And there's so much news about concussions. Well, builds character. That's funny. That's certainly one way of thinking about it. So, but the reality of it is, if you don't have that base of the pyramid, if you don't have people engaging in the game will die, whether you build leagues and infrastructure and player unions or whatever else it is that you're trying to build on top of these games. A lot of the early esports, part of the reason for those games becoming esports, in our opinion, is you have a commitment to fairness, so people are stopping cheating. You have a commitment, you actually have technology so that people can view the games. So there are very few games who actually have a spectator mode, which I think is pretty critical for all the enablement on top.
I just want to disagree a little bit with something you said. So I think the common view, I think the prevailing view is that you need a strong base of the pyramid in order to kind of fuel interest in the sport. And it may be true. It remains to be seen if the NFL has peaked and is on a decline. I think ratings might be on a decline, but revenue I don't think is declining. But even beyond that, 10 years ago, when every single leading indicator of growth for the NFL was hugely positive, revenue growth, ratings growth, every single engagement in any way you wanted to define it, the lion's share of people who followed NFL football never played football, and certainly never played football in any kind of organized way. And the same, by the way, is true pretty much for every major sport in the U.S. except maybe baseball and maybe basketball. And even then, most people didn't play baseball or basketball in any kind of competitive way beyond kind of the 8th grade. So absolutely, participation is important. I just think that it's a differentiator that actually is hugely favorable to esports, because roughly 60, 70%, maybe more of people who follow esports play that game or played that game. The segment of the audience that's growing fastest is actually the segment of people who don't actively play the game. So to me, I think that's a huge opportunity for esports. I don't think it needs to map on traditional sports in that way.
Yeah, the only thing that we miss and that we're starting to see now is legacy, right? So I had friends. My family was never a big sports family, but I had friends that were big Dallas Cowboy fans. And his dad was a Dallas Cowboys fan. He became a Dallas Cowboys fan. His son was a Dallas Cowboys fan. And now that we have these teams and these organizations and these esports going for a little while, now we're starting to see my friend's kid is growing up in a world that always had the Immortals as a team playing, right? And he gets to have some of that. He's got a little Immortals onesie that he's wearing, right? Those kind of things. And you're starting to see that people start attaching to those brands and that game and that thing, that we're starting to see that growth, that they watch it even though they don't play it, because that's what my family did on Sunday nights, right? And you're starting to see that growth that we haven't traditionally had. That's one enjoyment that we have that traditional sports has had over the years, that we're now starting to see that. We're having those generations now. It's weird in esports, but we're having generations of new players that are coming up that have never played or never been, or that, so that the viewership of that. So back to your point, you were talking about not that. We went up on a tangent.
But
Yeah, it just.
I did want to jump in on it, and maybe I can rebut. So
we're just going to go. We're going to rebut the rebut.
Well, here you go. So
have time.
let's think back across the history of humanity and organized sporting competition. The Colosseum in Rome, 3,000 years ago, first paid competitions,
Talk
first
about
prize
concussions.
competitions. Absolutely. Talk about a job, right? We don't have that anymore. It's gone.
Concussion is the least
Talk
of your
about
problem.
200 years ago.
MMA would disagree.
200, 300 years ago. Well, it's a different sport. 200, 300 years ago, you have jousting. Jousting's gone. You look at today and you talk about the NFL, you talk about basketball. So think about football. Football was invented in the 1860s. The first professional NFL formation was 1919, so about 50 years later. Same thing in basketball. Basketball was invented in the 1890s. The NBA was formed in 1949. If you look at actually across all of these activities, it's about 50 years from when people start popularizing a gameplay or a game type to when the professional organizations are created. We're right now at that period in video games. So if you think about 1970s, your first actual professional video game competition ever was a Space Invaders competition for 20 grand, open to the public. And you go to today, and by the way, this is part of the thing I talk to people often about, the viewing of esports. We've all been watching esports our whole lives. It's when you're standing in the living room and someone else is playing and you're not playing. That is viewing.
That's that
spectating.
hashtag esports. There's a bar that I feel like we try and separate between watching, like he's watching tennis,
let's call
table
it-
tennis.
Yeah, like that's saying that
Spectating
Let's
competitive
Play
gaming.
is strictly is a form of
Right.
esports.
Like me and my friends aren't the World Series of Poker when we play at our house, right? So it's like, what's the bar?
But
for
it's
esports?
still poker, isn't it?
Sure, but it's
Okay.
not.
So in the same way that
Well,
if you
yeah,
play
but you can say
basketball,
that,
well,
but-
let me
we're
finish.
arguing.
Sorry,
Finish
you're both
your point.
jumping on top of me. So how about let's talk about the sport of basketball. If I play a pickup game of basketball, is that a sport of basketball or is that not
it
basketball?
is, but it's not professional basketball.
Correct, it's
so-
not. But my point is, esports is not necessarily, and I think some of the industry is trying to say esports is only the NBA, it's only the NFL, and it's actually, no, it's what do you call the entire activity of playing and being watched in video games? You can't call it competitive gaming because it's not actually about competitive gaming. It's about friends, family. What is collegiate esports in your definition?
So just to take it back, would you lump a single person streaming a one-player game esports then?
No, because they're not competing.
So it's
It's
multiplayer.
competitive. It's competitive video game play where people are watching.
Okay, so there does have to be that competitive
parameter.
component
There has to be a
to
viewership.
qualify
So
as
watching
an
somebody
you
in
have,
my-
to, you have to have a
room.
viewable spectacle.
Okay.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's really your definite, when you say basketball as a sport, you're drawing the line. You're not saying, oh, I'm shooting hoops in my driveway. You would draw the line at, hey, these kids are playing in high school. That's still the sport of basketball, whether it's the NBA or high school or collegiate. And so the concept of a term of online or offline sports, esports, I think a lot of the mix has been, is esports just the NBA, or is esports people playing basketball competitively with viewing audiences? And the reason I would say esports is the broader set is because all of the monetization is the same. And actually the ability to monetize, I mean, people sell merchandise in collegiate teams, they have ads, they have actually all of that same activities as the pinnacle, right? In fact, I know the #1 organizer of collegiate esports, and they're independent. They're like a mini ESL, and they're building a business. They have a multi-million revenue business out of Boston. And I would argue very much so that is esports. And particularly when you think about from the game creator standpoint, those behaviors and those core loops and how that drives the kind of the retention of play is very similar. And the last point I'd just make is, and we brought this up a second ago, which is this idea that people are watching who have never played. I think that all goes back to a very, very old school social network of who are your friends, and almost everyone has a friend who's played football or played soccer who can explain what the game is and how it works. In fact, I grew up in a non-US family, so I didn't know how football worked until I was in my teens. And I actually had a friend who explained it to me, and I remember really well. I was 14 watching basically my first American football game. Before that, it's like Greek, right? And the problem with the broadcast is you really don't have enough time to explain to the viewer all the rules of football while they're trying to watch that broadcast. And so you have to have that friend, that parent, to explain how the game works.
One thing that I definitely want to look at right now or discuss, so we don't get too far off track, is what is, and you did mention some investment opportunities, and what I'd like to know is, as we see more consolidation in esports, as we see more companies coming together, more publishers buying up leagues, and things becoming more formalized, what are the investment opportunities, and what kind of return on interest will investors be seeing moving forward as they get more involved in esports and as this starts becoming a more...
So if I understand the question correctly, I think your ROI expectation as an investor is going to depend largely on where in the value chain or in the ecosystem you choose to play. So very similar to traditional sports, if you want to invest into a team, it's a fairly illiquid investment, and your return is largely going to be realized through enterprise value appreciation. In emerging sports, so not the NFL or the NBA, which as rightly pointed out, are kind of mature. In newer sports, like MLS, generally teams are cash flow negative each year, and ownership is benefiting because the value of the franchise goes up and up. So if you're going to jump into the fray and invest in a team, I don't think you should expect to experience a dividend check arriving in your mailbox annually. If you invest in a publisher, now, having said that, your beta, your opportunity for massive return is higher, probably, than if you invested in a publisher, where Activision probably isn't going to go bankrupt in the next 2 years. But it's also, well, who knows? I hope it does, but it's probably not going to 20x in value either. I think probably for most investors, and you would probably have a pretty sophisticated point of view on this because you're competing for investor capital all the time. It's a question of how can you marry the opportunity for relatively near-term value creation with liquidity. I would say that's the trade-off that people are trying to educate investors about. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of sectors to invest in, and there's a record amount of capital flowing into esports. And I think that's everything from content to distribution to quality of distribution, and we can talk about distribution and content in the context of both players and viewers. So there are games that are evolving that I think, like maybe golf early on, are much more about the player and much less about the viewer until you have new technologies like television that came out and really revolutionized the golf viewing experience. So when you think about content, you start to break that apart. There are mega brands like Activision Blizzard that are, a portion of what they're doing is esports. Of course, the problem with investing into them is you're not getting a pure play investment. There are smaller companies, like I mentioned PUBG, that I think many would agree, perhaps not here, but many would agree that PUBG is skyrocketing in retention, and the play behavior that's driving that is going to drive an organic esports scene against that game, whether they build it as a publisher or if we rewind the clock even on the esports scene, what happened was companies like Activision Blizzard didn't believe in esports and in competitive play behavior. They shut down South Korea activities rather than monetizing it. It took a decade more and a company like Riot to actually say, hey, wait a second, these people are just like watching our video games. We can monetize this. And one really important piece of the monetization
I have one point of contestation for that because during, World of Warcraft, the arena was actually part of MLG for a while.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, you were saying that Blizzard. Well, yeah, but you were saying that Blizzard was actively shutting it down.
I'm
talking about StarCraft.
Oh, StarCraft.
Early StarCraft Brood War.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, I'm talking about the very, very beginnings and grassroots of this movement. So your very first games are really Counter-Strike, arguably, and StarCraft, not kind of the modern set that has popularized. I mean, League of Legends did so much work to explain the term esports and blow that out to the world and to get the investment community excited about esports. And I think we're all very thankful for that change, and it's changed the very nature of what we're looking at in terms of investment. And so content, distribution quality, so there are a number of companies that are working on how to increase every aspect of distribution, whether it's online television or offline event companies like, you can invest, by the way, in ESL. They're owned by a publicly traded company, yeah, and so you can get into that. You can get into beyond the infrastructure piece. You can start to look at derivative industries like Unicorn, which is esports betting. I think what you'll see over time, and at least what we believe, is that the reason the human models and the contract models that have been created with offline sports have a lot to do with core focus of each business, and it's a vertically integrated experience right now that eventually becomes more and more horizontal. But that's the long view. We think it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff like Overwatch in the next 10 years, and we'll see how this all evolves. Having said that, the amount of capital flowing in now is at record levels. I think it's still early though. If you think about the sports industry offline in America alone, it's $100 billion. If you take kind of your global sports industry, it's multi-$100 billion industry. And so last year it was sub $1 billion in investment into the entire sector across kind of what everyone was doing. And so there's still a ton of opportunity to be an early investor in these spaces. And just know and think about the risks, right? If you do a piece of content, you have risk on content. If you do a team, you have exposure to geography potentially. There are different drawbacks to every part of the value chain. But drawbacks to us, right? We may not get more developers to adopt. The buy versus build for us. So every publisher that we work with has chosen to buy a esports partner rather than build in-house. And so, is the world long-term going to be all built in-house? Our bet is not just because of the amount of investment required to create Overwatch, for example. I mean, the game alone is, we agree, over 100 million?
Yes.
And then how much for the league?
A lot.
And then you just ask yourself the question, like, will long-term esports be only the NFL? Is there value in, I would argue there's value in badminton.
So I'll just add that there's value in the activity for a publisher. Unlike traditional sports, we make money on the game. So it doesn't matter if people are playing it because it's an esport, or playing it because they love it, or they believe in it because it's an esport. There's all these ties that we can talk about why an esport helps foster that community. But playing the game and monetizing on the game is the value to us. Everything else is awesome. And the spend that we have is a marketing spend of going, how do we increase this activity around the game, viewership, playership, monetization, to drive value back to us? So to your point, yes.
Well, and the true magic for you guys or any publisher is right now the biggest cost for video game companies, particularly in mobile, is advertising and buying players.
Building
User
it's expensive.
acquisition.
Building the game, buying
That's
the players.
expensive.
And so building is expensive. If you look at, let's say, League, you look at Overwatch, their marketing budget per year, if you add up the multiple years of marketing, you're looking at just massive investment versus the game build. So you're spending most of your money on marketing and getting distribution. And so if you think about like why do we want to be an esport for every company, it's so that you can create a viewing audience that organically drives players.
Well, live operations plays into that too. I mean,
live ops.
Yeah.
Yeah, live ops.
I mean, at least with the contracts that I've been negotiating, a lot of the money is moving towards live ops. I mean, you have a certain fixed amount or minimum guarantee for marketing, and there's obviously going to be overage for that. But when it comes to where the money is going now in development,
And to explain that, that's talking about the continued life of the game and supporting its servers and all the things that it takes to do that is what she's meaning by live ops.
So what are some of the biggest incentives bringing people to esports? And what do you think are going to be some of the incentives moving forward?
I'll start. Okay. So from a fan perspective, going back to like what is the reason why there's Olympics? The reason is because if I was in Sparta, I saw the guy who could run the fastest or jump the highest, and I wanted to see him compete against the guy from Athens. And so in any human pursuit, I believe that there's a desire to see like I can do this thing, but what does it look like to see the best people in the world do this thing? And esports and gaming is an amazing democratizing function to surface who the best people truly in the world actually are and give you an opportunity to see that. And so the thing that I think brings people into esports and keeps them there, like why is PUBG becoming so popular? Because first of all, there's an immediate return on your time spent playing or watching. You actually get better at the game and you can compete. That only makes you want to see what the best in the world look like even more. And so it's this virtuous cycle of commitment and return. Similarly, I think the opportunity to expand the net and bring people into the space who aren't necessarily first introduced through playing is becoming easier and easier. I think the barrier to entry is becoming lower because of models like Overwatch League, which bring in other experiences besides the content itself that connect. So I could bring my mom to an Overwatch League game. The only thing my mom knows about video games is she never wanted me playing them. That's it. But if she's sitting in the stands wearing an LA Valiant shirt and seeing 100 other people wearing Valiant green and gold and cheering for the same thing, that energy is what is drawing people to come back. And by the way, I worked in traditional sports for many years. I don't care what the sport is, the simplest sport, the most complex sport. You know what most people are doing during a professional sporting event? Most people, they're going like this. They're on their phone. They're looking at their phone, they're checking their email. Frankly, many of them are playing a game. So they're there not because they're super interested in the complexity of basketball and they really understand the strategy. People sometimes think they do, but talk to anyone who actually knows basketball and they'll tell you that 99.99% of the people who watch don't know anything, except the very, very basic rudimentary rules. They're there because of the connection. And esports, in an organized way, has not provided that experience at scale before. Tournaments were more ad hoc or annual, and now it's moving towards a model, an offline model, a live ops model, whatever you want to call it, that gives people the chance to connect to each other in a social environment around really compelling content and a lot of fun, and that's very new. And as this youngest generation becomes more fragmented in their day-to-day activity, spending more time at home, spending more time on the phone, spending more time away from socialized activity, I actually think the opportunity to connect to content that you're excited about as a young person, but with other people in a social environment, is going to become even more profound. My generation has a problem a little bit understanding that that social experience can be realized online or offline, but that's my issue. That's not the issue of someone who's 15. The person who's 15 is looking for that connection, playing the game, watching the game, or attending the event. And so the opportunity for growth of the fan base at the grassroots is very exciting. I see the market growing a lot.
Hi, do you see any future in junior leagues or 13 and under?
Absolutely. So I think Andrew brought up the point. I mean, colleges are organizing at scale very rapidly. I mean, the Big Ten, which is, if not the most profitable collegiate enterprise, the second most, I mean, it's one of the big ones, it's going to have organized esports. I think by 2024, 2028, esports will be in the Olympics. So at global scale, amateur competition at the highest level, and that trickles down. I mean, how do you get into, if Penn State is offering a scholarship for esports, who gets the scholarship? It's people who are best at high school. There's a really cool company based out of Santa Monica called Super League that's doing a great job of kind of lowering the age of competition. I've also talked to really diverse organizations that view esports and the opportunity to connect with young people as an entry point for all sorts of activity. So youth groups at temples or synagogues or churches are trying to think about how can we create an opportunity for young people to find us by meeting them where they are. And so they're starting to host not amateur competitions, but just like they might have a church basketball league. And so two things are going to happen. Number one, there's going to be more people recognizing that this is a way to connect with young people, and so creating the opportunity. But second, young people are going to become older people, and they're going to be less concerned with the content of the games, and they're going to recognize that it's actually a lot safer in many ways than traditional sports. And so parental kind of approval, parental barriers are going to be lowered. So I see junior leagues and the youth level being a market that's going to grow probably faster, frankly, from a participation standpoint than professional competitive.
But speaking specifically to the types and kinds of games, right? Not everybody designs esports. We design multiplayer games that we have aspirations and compatibility with esports, but that doesn't mean that it becomes an esport. We've seen many failures over the years of games that have tried and failed, right? And so I think you'll see more development catering towards those groups and those timeframes for sure, or those people.
Like Rocket League is a great...
It's a perfect example.
So, and by the way, Rocket League, the formal structure of Rocket League is a combination, a partnership between a publisher and a distributor. And it's great content, it's fun to play, it's easy to play, the game length is shorter than, say, League of Legends, the rules are easy. So games like that are clearly designed towards a younger audience.
Yeah, lowering the barrier of entry, right, making it more accessible.
I was just curious, do you guys think that the esports industry is going to be successful, and is that inevitable? Or are there going to be pivotal moments in the near future? And if so, what are those pivotal moments?
Did you say the esports industry will
Be successful.
be successful?
Inevitably.
Inevitably. Again, back to esports is kind of an industry. It's a wrapper, right? It's a marketing term. But I feel like, yeah, I think it's going to be successful. I think it's successful now in lots of ways. It's about the measurement and of the ROI. How do publishers measure success? You know, how are we measuring success of our esports program and our marketing activities? How is a team measuring their ROI of their investment, right? And same thing for you as a league structure, like what's ours? So I think that, yes, all these individual successes make the overall industry successful. So yeah, I think we're successful now in many ways.
You know, and I think kind of the bigger commentary is we live in a time of kind of unprecedented technology evolution. So if you kind of follow Moore's law and computing and what's happening, we're almost leveled off on computing power and needs for desktops. You have mobile and smartphone catching up, and I think what we'll see, and how many people here, by the way, just show of hands, have tried the Void? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's an immersive VR experience. It's a startup company that actually, they have an experience here at Disneyland that you can try. I've been talking to many people about it. You'd think I'm promoting it. I always promote things that I believe in. If you try this experience, I guarantee you, you'll feel like I can see where things will be in 10 years. And if we live in a near future where virtual reality and augmented reality become commonplace, those types of experiences, you know, the next Pokemon Go times 10, I think you're going to see all the competitive behavior that's happened, you know, first in desktop and console, moving into VR and AR. And you know, and so when you think about esports, I really think about it. I want people to think a lot about, will digital competition be a thing? Offline competition was important. Will people do the same activity with computers? I'd argue yes.
Just look at competition as a whole. People are competitive and love to find things to be competitive about, whether it's flipping pennies, whether it's yo-yo content, whatever. They're always going to find something, and this is a really accessible level of competition that people will be able to play in. So
Personally, I love flipping pennies.
So let me give you a couple of pivotal events that I think are going to be coming up in the next couple of years. One is whether or not Overwatch League is successful. If Overwatch League is successful, it means that there is a market for local franchising at global scale. That has implications both for esports and traditional sports. Right now, the NBA doesn't have a team in China or Mexico City. I think in 20 years, if Overwatch League is successful, and maybe even if it isn't, it will. That's one. Two, something I'm really looking closely at is, will the average age, the median age of esports fans, so people who are connected to a team and watching the games online, that's how I'm defining it for the purposes of this answer, will that age increase or decrease? If it increases, that means that there is a stickiness and a generational thing happening where someone is likely playing the game or finding the game as a teenager or younger, becoming a fan in their teens and 20s, and then sticking with that game later. If it goes earlier, it means that really it's going to just cycle through. And the age will go from kind of 30 back to 18, 24, and the cycle will start again. I think that has massive implications for how these games are positioned and marketed to and where the investment dollars are going to come from in the future. And the third thing is the power dynamic between publisher and team. So publishers clearly are trying to develop IP that is going to sell at the greatest scale, and esports is one way to drive sales. If the team model is not successful, though, esports still are a powerful opportunity to drive game sales. And so what will happen? Publishers will just incubate these leagues and fund the teams, I think. So those are some things. I think all of that will be settled in the next 10 years.
Thank you guys for the great panel. It was very interesting to learn.